Hi everyone, welcome to chapter 6. This chapter is on surveys and observations. So really what this chapter is about is describing what people are doing. So we're going to talk about kind of both of these methods and break down a little bit about when they can be used, what things we should and shouldn't be doing when we use each type of method, and just generally kind of describing how we as psychologists in research can observe people and what are the techniques that we use to do that. So chapter 6, surveys and observations. Again, just describing what people do. So we're going to break this chapter down into two main sections. The first section is we're going to talk all about surveys and different polls and basically using some type of form or formal sort of questions to ask people and getting feedback that way. We'll talk about how to make sure that those are valid and have construct validity throughout. Then we're also going to talk about, same thing, construct validity of observational research or observing what people are doing as well. So both of these methods are really just aimed at understanding what people are doing and seeing how we can interpret and understand sort of the thought process in their behavior. And so we can do that either by directly asking them through questions and surveys and polls, or by observing their behavior and then interpreting what that behavior might mean. So let's start off first on the side of surveys and actually asking them questions directly. So again, we're going to break this down and talk about some different construct validities and making sure that we are being valid in how we do this and that we ask questions in a good and solid way to get good answers that we can then use and interpret across individuals and for different studies. So we're going to talk about surveys and polls. We're going to talk about how to format those questions, how the questions should be structured and organized. We're going to talk about the importance of well-written questions and see actually how some responses can change based on how the question is worded. And then we'll just finally also talk about just how we can encourage participants to respond accurately. So when we talk about surveys and polls, there are lots of different types of questions that we can actually choose to ask participants. So there's kind of like 4 different categories here, 4 different types of questions that are the most common ways that we ask participants information about what they're doing. The first one is simply through open-ended questions. So we could just ask a question and participants can tell us whatever they want. They could type it in, they could respond verbally, but they're giving us just a free response question based on their own thoughts and feelings of what they have been asked. And these can be really helpful in seeing the real raw information that participants might have. Now, that raw information might be really good and really valuable because you're not constraining participants into a set type of response. But it might also be kind of hard to interpret because participants might not give you exactly the answer or the framed answer that you were looking for. It's also a challenge sometimes to then compare one participant's response to another participant's response because they might be focusing on different aspects of the question and you can't necessarily compare them one-to-one with each other. So we often use open-ended questions for early research, sometimes exploratory research or research that generally is trying to just kind of get that raw information and wants to really see what participants think in the situation without, again, forming them or placing them into some restrictive box, which we'll see in some of the next answer questions. Pros and cons to each type of question, but this one here, the pro is that we can really see that raw information from the participant. The con, it might be hard to interpret. Next, we have what we call forced choice questions. And these are questions where there may only be 2 answer choices, like a yes or a no. And it really forces participants into one of these choices. And this can be a benefit because now we are really easily able to compare one participant to another. They either fall into one category or they fall into the other category. But again, you can see the contrast or the trade-off here in that now we are really restrictive in how participants are providing us information, and maybe there's nuance that gets lost or left out that we aren't classifying or we aren't getting because we simply have them respond with either yes or no or one of 2 options. And so again, trade-offs, pros and cons to this, but you can see some of the benefits of really narrowly focusing your question, but maybe missing out on some nuance. Then, of course, we have the Likert scale. And this is a really common, really popular way of asking questions, especially in psychology, because we kind of get a little bit of both or the best of both worlds here, where we can see some nuance, some range of responses within participants, but we're still restricting it to a very clear question that we're asking them. And so they might respond on that scale, but very clearly that is focused and directed towards the question that was asked, but we also get the nuance of someone who might be in the middle or might be slightly more towards the ends of the question response. And so Likert scales, like I said, are very popular because they capture a little bit of both of these benefits of these question types, where there is a little bit more nuance, but also we're very carefully restricting what participants can respond with. We also have what are called semantic differential questions, and these are very similar to Likert questions. However, they don't have the anchor points of strongly disagree, agree, things like that. It's more just asking a participant to respond on a scale from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 or whatever the number range may be in regard to the question that they are asked. So again, very similar pros and cons to Likert style questions, just less of those anchoring terms in a semantic differential question. Let's next talk about how we word questions. And I want to point out and make an important point here that well-written questions are important in surveys because, as we'll see, how you word the question can have drastic changes in how participants respond. Participants' responses should be their true feelings towards the question, but how we word that question might bias or change those responses. And so we can see here in this example, which is on specifically voter laws and voter ID, the more we start to incorporate information or background information about this topic, the more we see that change occur. So just presenting the question flatly in the first line, we see that a larger majority of people respond positively to these voter laws. But when we start incorporating maybe some of the consequences or negative pieces of information that these voter laws might have as an effect, we start to see less people align with or agree with these laws. And so how we word questions, how much information we provide, can bias and change participants' responses when they're actually answering the questions. We also need to be careful of falling for sort of these question pitfalls. Some examples of these are things like double worded questions. So these are basically like two questions in one. For example, do you enjoy swimming and wearing sunscreen? Well, maybe you enjoy swimming, but you don't enjoy wearing sunscreen. But if it's asked in one question and you can only respond with one answer, it becomes really kind of muddied and hard to distinguish which of these pieces of the question were you really answering. And so some people might say yes because they answered yes to part of the question, but some people might kind of interpret this question differently. And so we want to try to avoid questions like this, double-worded questions, questions that have multiple pieces to them. We want to be more clear and direct and ask each one individually so that we can get pieces of the puzzle or those individual responses on the aspects of the question that we're curious about. And then we can put them together and compare people that maybe both enjoy swimming and wearing sunscreen, but we shouldn't ask that together in the same question. Negatively worded questions can also be a challenge because sometimes participants can get confused and misunderstand how these questions are supposed to be interpreted and answered. So if we ask questions like, people who do not drive with a suspended license should never be punished. Well, now we have to sit and think and try and reverse the negatives and how many negatives are there and what is this actually asking, and maybe we can arrive at the true question of what it's really trying to get at and answer it accurately. Or maybe we get confused along the way as participants and we think we know what this question is asking, but we flip it and actually respond in the opposite direction than we would have intended to. And so these questions are really, again, something to try and avoid. We want to instead try to limit as many negatives in our question as possible and only ask the direct question that they can respond with. Similarly, you might see here on this point of how we actually present our scale. In this example, we see the scale goes from disagree to agree on the left to agree on the right, and those range in value from 1 to 5. And how we present this information can bias participants as well. So in this case, maybe that makes sense where higher values are associated with agreeing with that response. But oftentimes what you'll actually see is that maybe agree is on the left and disagree is on the right. There isn't necessarily a gold standard for which way this goes. The most important thing is when designing your survey, you should have a consistent pattern of which side you have disagree and which side you have agree on. So if you're constantly flipping those, sometimes it's on the left, sometimes it's on the right, that can confuse participants and they might respond inaccurately, thinking they're giving one answer when really they're giving a different one. So what I always say is pick a method to stick to and make sure your whole survey sticks to that format. Having, again, agree on one side or on the other side. Normally, higher values are associated with positive or agreement, and lower values are associated with disagreement. And that's more of a standard that is pretty common. But which side of the page it's on, that might vary. And then the last piece here is question order and which order we present questions in. This is also important when you're going through and creating your surveys, because you want to make sure that questions that might be strongly influencing or biasing or priming participants aren't set up in a way that can influence their responses later on. Here, a good example of this is with something like stereotype threat, where you might have a demographic question asked early on in your survey, and that just kind of primes and brings to the surface that piece of themselves, and that may then bias how they're responding to further questions in your survey. So sometimes people argue that it's actually better to put demographic questions and other questions that just might bias a participant at the end of your survey. Now, I kind of say it depends on which questions you're using and how you're using those questions. For example, I always like putting questions like age early on in the survey, but that's because I use it as a filtering question to filter out anybody who doesn't meet my age requirements. So there's a little bit of strategy here in how we organize and present our questions, but it is still important to keep this thought in mind and make sure that we don't present questions that could prime or alter responses that are asked after them. Now, how people actually respond to questions is important to talk about here as well. We can talk about how people give responses, and sometimes they give meaningful responses, and that's great. Sometimes they don't. So how much information they have and how they're able to actually respond, how accurately they're able to actually respond, might vary based on a lot of these factors. And so it's important to talk about this here. So people sometimes use shortcuts even when answering questions. And so a couple of these that we've identified and that we can kind of discuss here are things like maybe using response sets, where they will have some idea in mind and kind of go through and answer questions in bulk or in large chunks to kind of get through the survey faster. So maybe that might answer all of one question in one way and then kind of go on and just kind of fill out the survey in a line. We might also see them doing what's called acquiescing or yes saying, where they're trying to answer the questions not how they truly feel, but based on how they think the researcher wants them to answer. This is a problem in research, and this is something that we can try to eliminate by trying to have more separation, more anonymity in responses, and having that researcher be less present during this response phase of participants actually answering these questions. We also see this idea of fence sitting, where participants instead may kind of sit more towards the middle of a survey and respond more down the center. They're not really deciding one way or the other, especially on Likert type scale questions, which way they actually want to answer the question. So they might answer it kind of down the center. One way we have of trying to kind of combat this is, rather than using something like a 5-point Likert scale, which has that middle value, you could use something like a 4 or a 6-point Likert scale, which then divides it into even numbers, and you no longer have a center neither disagree or agree option. So they are forced into at least slightly agreeing or disagreeing. And this may or may not be appropriate based on the question you're asking, but it is one method of trying to kind of combat against this idea of fence sitting. Oftentimes, participants also try to answer questions in a way to make themselves look good. So they might answer questions that they want to make themselves appear a little bit better than they actually are. And so this might, again, be less accurate than how they should actually be answering questions. Sometimes we also see them answer questions in a way that makes them deliberately look worse. This is less common, but it is something that's there, where they might just want to present themselves in a way that is maybe a little bit more exaggerated, either good or bad, than how they actually are. And so this is something that's challenging to kind of filter out and fix, but it's something to be aware of and how we kind of interpret responses. Sometimes participants may also try to report more than they can actually know. And so these could be questions, sometimes more open-ended questions, that participants provide responses that really they have no way of knowing that information. So I might ask, for example, like, why is it that you buy the brand of yogurt that you buy? And maybe you don't actually know why that is, but you could give me an answer, and maybe that answer sounds plausible and reasonable, but really you have, maybe not intentionally, but maybe you have created this idea of why you buy that brand of yogurt, but that's not really the true reasons why you buy that yogurt. So maybe you think, oh, it's the most affordable yogurt, or it's the one I like the taste of the best. But in reality, maybe the true answer has more to do with how that yogurt was marketed or advertised, or there are other factors that you aren't aware of. And so you might be reporting something that you think you know, but you really may not. And we also see this kind of take place through memory as well. So we talk a lot about this in other courses about how bad our memories actually are. So if you've ever taken a cognitive psychology class, you'll learn about this, that our memories are really far worse than we think that they are. And so participants might respond with information and things that they remember that is actually not accurate. And this is something that is, again, really challenging to combat, but something we should be aware of. And then again, similar to this idea of the yogurt, but how we rate consumer products varies quite a bit. And so I think a lot of the times too, when we read consumer research, we see a lot of this bias and this maybe inaccuracy in how we're interpreting research. But this is also important in how we rate consumer products and just kind of being able to understand this process. All right, so that was kind of the first section, looking all at asking participants questions through surveys and things like that. This next half of the lecture is going to talk about observational research and how we can instead find information through observing people. And some people argue that this is better or more accurate because of some of the limitations we just talked about, people not always responding accurately, maybe not being able to assess themselves accurately, whether deliberately or not. And so the argument sometimes is made that observing people naturally has less bias than asking them to interpret their own actions and behaviors. So we're going to talk now about this observational technique and kind of break down some pros and cons of this as well. So the first example here to kind of look at and talk about is just one that kind of shows maybe why observational research might be better. So this claim here is looking at the idea that maybe traditionally or stereotypically, an argument was made that women tend to talk more than men. And so if you ask people this question and they self-report or they self-respond, you might see data that supports this claim. But what was done in this research is they actually had a device that would measure participants talking and kind of record it throughout a period of a day. And they gave it to different participants, both men and women, and then they measured overall how many words each of them spoke to assess this claim. And what they found was that in reality, there really wasn't a big difference between men and women, and neither really spoke more or less than the other. And so we can see that this observational research technique here might be less biased and actually provide more accurate responses than trying to ask someone this question alone. Another example here of how we can see observational research being better than self-report research is in this example of this study that observed how siblings interact with one another. And so it looked at sibling interactions across different cultures and looked to see if siblings, when working and solving a problem, took more cooperative strategies to solve the problem or more individualistic strategies. And when asking siblings and asking children how they think they worked together, most of them responded in a way that indicated that they thought they were working together to solve the problem. But what we see through actual observational data is that this varied amongst different cultures. And so you can see that in certain cultures, we saw more through those blue observations, more collaborative strategies and behaviors that they employed versus other cultures where they used more individualistic strategies and took their own sort of approach at solving these problems. And so again, this just points to the distinction between observational research and self-report research and how sometimes observational research might be a better way to get at sort of what's actually going on. However, there is sort of one thing we need to keep in mind when looking at observational research, and that's primarily, well, who is the observer and what is their bias that is being incorporated into the equation? So while we've sort of eliminated the participant's bias and them self-reporting, now we've introduced observer bias, and that observer that is now interpreting the behaviors of the participant, they might be biased in what they're actually interpreting. Looking at this is also an important piece and a potential limitation of observational research. So there's two examples of this that we can use to talk about and to highlight. The first one is this idea of the bright and dull rats. So this is a really interesting study where a group of participants was given, separated into two different groups, and one group was given a set of rats that they were told were really good at solving mazes, and the other group was given a set of rats that they were told were really bad at solving mazes. They were either bright or dull. And they asked participants to observe these rats and mark down how well they were solving the maze, how fast they solved the maze. And what they found was that participants who had the rats that they were told were good at solving mazes reported seeing good progress, fast solving times. And participants who had rats that they were told were bad at solving mazes reported slower solving times and less beneficial behaviors to solve the maze. Now, the key here, what's crazy about this is that actually all the rats were the same. So there was no actual difference in how well these rats solved mazes, but the observer had this bias planted into them, and so they observed behaviors with this lens in mind. And so it's important to keep this in mind when looking at observational research, because the researcher brings about their own bias, whether that's actually something that is caused through the study or something that just is naturally occurring within that observer. And so this is a challenge here and something that we want to try to be aware of and, again, potentially avoid. And the ways that we can try to fix or avoid this is by having multiple observers observe the same participants and code those or interpret those behaviors independently, and then compare their observations and see if they match one another. And if they do, that's more likely the case that they would be accurate. And if they don't, well, then maybe it's because of those observer biases. Another fun example to talk about here, just to kind of elicit this, is the example of Clever Hans. And there's many other animal examples that look at the same idea, but Clever Hans was a horse who could supposedly solve math problems. And when it all boiled down, Hans wasn't actually able to solve math problems, but what he could do was interpret the micro behaviors and movements and feelings of his caretaker. And so what he was doing is actually interpreting when his counting matched the correct answer, and he would stop at that point based solely on the response or the feedback given by his caretaker. And so again, this is a good example of this idea of observer bias, because the observers of this, watching Hans solve these math problems, were biased in wanting him to succeed and wanting to believe that he was actually solving these math problems. And so they thought he was, they observed him doing this, even though that's not actually what was going on. And so again, observer bias, one of the biggest problems in observational research. Best way to overcome this is having multiple observers code or interpret behavior independently and then comparing those responses. Another really important piece to try and minimize observer bias is having clear coding or clear descriptions of what those observations are supposed to be. So you can see in this example, going back to the study on collaboration with siblings, that there were very clear examples of what different collaboration types and different individualistic strategies meant. And so the researchers acting as observers here very clearly read and understood what behaviors were necessary to be classified as cooperative behaviors. And so having this clear outline, again, and having multiple observers use this clear outline is the best way to try to reduce observer bias. Now, what happens when participants are aware they're being watched and change their behavior because of that? Well, that can also be a problem with observational research. And again, some of the things we see here and solutions to this are doing things like trying to blend in as much as possible. So maybe you just try to really kind of sit in the back, blend into the background as much as possible, and try to kind of make yourself as small as possible and as minimal of a factor as you can. And this might be one way to reduce the effect of someone changing their behavior from being watched. Another option is to wait it out. And this just basically means doing multiple observations repeatedly and over time until the participant sort of just adapts to you being there and then kind of goes back to more being normal. And then you kind of use a true observation to their behavior. And so as they kind of get used to you being there or an observer being there, they go back to behaving more naturally. And then lastly is, rather than observing the actual behavior you're trying to measure, maybe instead you observe the result of the behavior. So one example might be if you want to measure the amount of candy students eat in their dorms. Well, rather than going around and checking to see who's eating candy, you could instead just at the end of the day measure how many candy wrappers are in a trash can. And so, yes, maybe this isn't as perfect of a solution, but it is one way to eliminate that bias in a participant being observed. And so the last point here to really talk about in observational research is the ethics of this. And so we might have some questions about the ethics of observing someone and whether or not we can do this or not. Generally speaking, we say that in public settings or public spaces, observing someone naturally is generally okay to do. One important piece is to make sure we're not identifying participants in any way and that we are really just observing them only in this public space and in these settings. If instead we have laboratory settings where we're observing someone using other techniques or other methods, well, of course, then we would need some type of consent and going through the proper ethics forms to get that done. So again, just kind of wrapping up, we have the two kind of methods of assessing participants through surveys or through observations. Each have their pros and cons, and we've talked a little bit about some of each of those. Each induce bias either through the participant or through the observer, and there are ways to reduce this bias as much as possible, but no research is perfect. No method of assessing a participant is perfect, so we have to choose the best approach that we can for the given context or the given study that we're trying to do at the time.